Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name's Jordan. I'm the Sustainability Officer for North Sydney Council. And tonight we're here to talk about solar for strata, specifically an Australian solution from the company Allume, which enables a solar PV systems to be shared across individual apartment units. Residential solar PV systems are a key part of what we're promoting at council and a key part of our strategic direction as outlined in our sustainability strategy. What we're trying to do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions, community emissions by 65% from the 1996 levels. Other ways that we're supporting renewable energy and the adoption of renewable energy, green energy, electrifying homes with appliances such as hot water heat pumps and reverse cycle aircon, and also assisting businesses and residents to disconnect from gas. That's all outlined in our Electrify North Sydney program. So thank you, everyone. Before we go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on tonight, the Camaragal people, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Couple of housekeeping things, just that we are recording today, so all the participant mics and cameras have been turned off, and we will share the YouTube recording on our YouTube channel afterwards. Feel free to ask any questions, so pop that in the Q&A. Any sort of comments, general sort of links or anything like that, just chuck them in, put them in the chat, and then we can, for other people to have a look at. So, yeah, really delighted to welcome William Anstey. He is the Housing Partnership Manager from the Allume team, and so he's come tonight to talk to more about their solar sharing system. So, welcome, Will. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Jordan. Really appreciate it. Happy to be part of the North Sydney Council efforts, I guess, for education in this space. Worked quite closely with the North Sydney Council for several years now. So some people may know of me or may know of at least SolShare being the product that we provided Allume as well. So first thing I'd sort of say as well is encourage any sort of questions from everyone as we can. No matter how sort of small or silly they may seem, feel free to ask them. I'm going to zip through basically tonight and cover basically the fundamentals of shared solar and strata, how that sort of looks on a building, sort of the value adds associated with that for all different owner types, owner occupiers, landlords, renters, etc. And give you guys a bit of an insight into what's coming across the state of New South Wales and what we've seen in other states as well. So really excited to share a little bit of info, and then we'll sort of finish off with answering your questions and answering all of them. So yeah, keen for some curly ones if you can put them through. So it's a good opportunity to do that. And then hopefully, you'll be able to share a lot of this information buildings as well. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll kick off with some of the slides. We get to see the very joyous Allume team. So again, welcome everyone. This is basically the Melbourne part of our company. We are an international company, so we do have a few teams in the US and the UK, but head office is down here in Melbourne, although I do personally spend a fair bit of time up in Sydney as well. So very familiar with New South Wales and work quite closely with state and federal, state and local government up there as well as federal. You got me down the front, but you may see Liz on the far right for anyone that goes through our processes or inquires directly. Liz you'll probably speak to, and maybe the odd other person throughout the team. Well, so just to sort of kick off, we always have this fundamental question of, why shared solar? Traditionally, for those that aren't aware, solar has been very difficult to traditionally get on apartment buildings. So up until SolShare existed, there was very limited opportunity scope to do that, and not something that sort of met the needs of the actual apartment residents or strata residents to the full degree. So with that, we're quite excited to be able to share this with you guys tonight, and I'm sure we've got varying levels of knowledge when it comes to these things as well. But some of the key sort of drivers behind people obtaining shared solar is, turning your idle roof into a money saver or money maker at the end of the day. It depends how you want to put it. So, those ever increasing costs of electricity. In New South Wales is a little bit more expensive than Victoria, for example. I'm based down in Vic, as I mentioned earlier, so it's it's good sort of opportunity, and you guys have more sun as well, which is always beautiful. Put the solar panels to work. A big aspect of this as well is future-proofing your building. So we find that solar is always the first key thing because that benefits everyone within the building. You then have the next steps, whether it's EVs, batteries, etc., that may not benefit everyone. So it's always good to get kicked off, bring everything up to spec and up to speed. So then you can do that future electrification as desired. Big part of it as well is increasing the value of your building. A lot of these apartments that we've seen, I've actually done a lot of data collection on how the value increase of those apartments has actually increased in buildings with SolShare or shared solar compared to those in the localized suburb that haven't. So there's some really good data points, so happy to share a bit of that. But of course, by having your own source of energy, you do decrease your reliance on electricity retailers for the network. So it means you sort of are less at risk of the rising cost of living pressures as well. So that's always a win. So with that, I'd love to introduce SolShare. So SolShare is our product there, white box on the wall. To give a bit of an insight, we are installed in over 2,500, almost 3,000 individual apartments across Australia, plus installs in 7 other countries around the world, including New Zealand, but including countries such as Wales as well. So varying amounts of sun. But here is a few of our Australian installs. On the top right is a New South Wales one. Same with the middle on the bottom there. I believe that one's in Neutral Bay from memory, up in New South Wales. But it gives an insight into the different types of assets here as well today. I was actually on the site today on the bottom right here, and this one's down in Murrumbina, which is a 12 apartment complex. Out of curiosity, actually fully owned by a landlord who put this on as a really good value add and marketing opportunity for their build to rent, which they're all build to rent sort of apartments, or they're just rented out at the end of the day because he did build it for that reason. But it gives an insight to it, the fact that it's an established technology and is ready to be utilized by anyone that's sort of interested there. So on top of that, what I'd like to go through now is just a bit of an infographic on how the SolShare actually does work, our SolShare box. To give you a bit of a description, we'll kick off with the solar panels. So in this scenario here, we've got a 15 apartment building, so nice and typical. So you've got one group of solar panels on the rooftop. In this scenario, let's say it's 25 kilowatts of solar. Down there, it then feeds down to an inverter. Now, for those that don't know, the inverter is required for any solar system, and that converts that DC power, which is the power generated by those solar panels, and turns it into AC power, which is power that can be used within the home. Now, once the inverter processes that energy is then passed on through to the SolShare box, which the Allume SolShare here. And we then provide a physical cable, although there's one arrow here, there is actually a physical cable that goes to each and every electricity meter on a meter board. So all those meters are usually located together, usually on the ground floor, and everyone will have their own physical solar supply. So it means everyone gets the electrons from that solar system directly to that tenancy or behind the meter. So then if you're consuming energy in your apartment at that point in time, you're actually self-consuming solar within that apartment. And then if there's any extra need for energy, you can still top that up by the grid. So once the sun goes down, of course, you need extra energy from the grid, but it gives you a little bit of an idea on how that works there. Now, the key thing is by sharing this system on that rooftop, you get, I guess, really good use of roof space. So what that means is you don't have to divvy up the rooftop into little blocks and have our own little couple of panels each. It is one large system that's shared among all. A good scenario would be if you compared it to, say, a suburban street. Let's say you had 15 individual homes, all with their own systems on each rooftop, and then having that ability to actually share everyone's solar together. If you're not home for the week, you might have gone on holidays for the week. Maybe everyone else at home could have used your solar. So that's the idea with this as well. So to elaborate on that, a good use case to explain that is we actually measure, well, in reality, we actually measure the demand of each apartment. So, constantly in this scenario, we'd be looking at, how much energy is being used instantaneously by all 15 apartments. And then based on that, we actually then provide that solar to those who need it when they need it. Now, of course, usually the first question we get when it comes to this is, what happens if someone's a really big energy user and uses all that solar? Well, the beauty of how SolShare actually works is we work on a per calendar month basis, but per calendar month, we ensure that no set or single individual can actually receive more or even less than what they're entitled to. So an analogy I like to use is, imagine everyone has if we had 15 empty cups of water at the start of the month. Now, use electricity and water here just as an analogy, although they probably shouldn't mix on a safety point of view. But let's imagine the SolShare is then filling up each of those 15 cups throughout the calendar month every time that they become, I guess, thirsty for energy or thirsty for electricity or water. Now, the SolShare will fill each and every one of those cups up throughout that month when they're thirsty. And then the purpose of the SolShare is to ensure at the end of the month, everyone's cup is full, no one's is underfilled, and no one's is overfilled. And we ensure that everyone has received the total volume of solar associated with that. Now, of that total volume, you will, as with any solar system, you'll self-consume a portion of that. So that's where, instead of buying grid energy from the network, from your retailer, you get to self-consume that solar. But then a portion of that you'll sell back to the electricity retailer yourself. So, at times of the day when no one else may be using solar and there might be a net export in the overall building, you may be selling some of that for a feed-in tariff back to your electricity retailer, which is still very, very normal. Those feed-in tariffs are the ones that used to be worth a lot back in the day when not many people had got solar. But now, because there is a lot of people with solar, they are a much smaller amount. So, those early adopters were able to access that really good benefit. Now, from there as well, as far as the equitable sharing goes, as I mentioned, everyone has, say, if we had 15 identical cups, you can actually have different size cups. So where there are different lot entitlements, then you can have different size cups, but ensuring that everyone still gets their set portion of energy and solar. Now, the key thing to note is we do get as close to lot entitlement as possible. Some sites do have some electrical limitations, but we work through them and make sure that there's something that's feasible for those as well. And then from there, just on a feasibility point of view, so the SolShare will be connected as close to that meter board as possible. So you may only have 1 or 2 meters of cable per apartment. A common misconception is having to cable to each individual apartment subboard. In reality, that's not what is needed. So it just shows that it's, from a, I guess, what's the word that's best from a disruption point of view, it's very low. So it means that a lot of the people within a building won't even know the solar's been installed, throughout that process. Usually there's a small shutdown period to safely connect into the system to that local network, but it is very low there. But the key part of this is the dynamic sharing, of course, as I mentioned earlier. So very common, if some people work from home some parts of the day, or work from the office other days. It varies the amount of solar that you receive to be when you need it is when you receive solar. So there's that really cool piece there for that as well. Now, to back that up, this sort of gives you an example of a comparison between a system without the SolShare. So that is where each and every apartment would have their own individual system. So in this scenario, every apartment may have a 1.7 kilowatt individual system. So what that means, each and every apartment has their own inverter, and they can produce up to that amount of solar available to them at any point in time. So as we can see here, during the morning period, the green line is above. So the green line represents solar production, and the dark navy blue line represents your actual energy usage. So at those points in time where the solar provision is above what you're using, that's all being sold back to the grid, and you're receiving a 7-cent feed-in tariff. Now, where the electricity use line is above what the solar can produce, everything what's not taken up by the solar, you're purchasing from the grid or from your electricity retailer. And that's where you're paying that 30-cent mark. So really the ideal is to move all of this export from the mid-morning to then say the middle of the day when you're actually using it. Now, traditionally you would have to do that with a battery. But with the way that SolShare works, and we've got a scenario down the bottom here, which is an apartment with the same amount of solar allocation, 1.7 kilowatts, but it's connected to SolShare. So in this scenario, what happens is you're not unnecessarily feeding back to the grid all day, every day, because there are multiple apartments using this solar at one point in time. Then it means that some of that solar can be used by some people when they're using it. In this case, this person can access a lot more during the middle of the day where they have need for it. So although they have 1.7 kilowatts of solar allocated, they've actually been able to access up to 4.5 kilowatts of solar at that point in time. A lot of cases you can access up to 6.6 even, very similar to a standard residential system. But in saying that, remember, this is a shared system, but a very small allocation per apartment, but then designed to be suitable for those apartments. A very big misconception when it comes to apartments is the amount of solar that's actually required. And people always relate it to that of a standalone home. But you do have to remember that apartments are smaller, they're insulated by each other, and usually a smaller footprint as well. But we can go into that as well. Now, I just saw a brief question pop up as well, which I hadn't touched on as well. So with these shared systems, you do have all your apartments as well as the common area connection as well. And you have the ability to set that, just like I mentioned earlier with the cups, you might have quite a large cup for the common area. So that can be fully utilized that way. Even if you have an existing system on site for your common area, you could add SolShare to then extend that to the apartments. But happy to provide some advice on that as well. So a bit of a random image, this one, but we always put this in just as sort of a bit of a laugh, because what we find is similar to, say a pool in an apartment building, although not many actually have them. It is a common asset, shared by all. Everyone gets that benefit of the asset. They get to use it at different times. A lot of people could use it at the same time, but there's that easy spread benefit among everyone for that as well. So it's a good example of a shared solar system, how that is also related to an apartment building, as everyone's benefiting from it with that. Now, other key thing to note is the case for investor owners. Now, although the decision-making process in New South Wales for any sort of shared solar solution is just a standard ordinary resolution. So that's where you just need a majority vote as long as you've reached a quorum for voting. There is still that decision-making process to ensure that the landlord investors have some sort of needs met. Now, there are a few considerations that go into this. These are some of the most common ones that we communicate and we speak to landlords about. One of the key things is some of the home energy ratings, which will be coming in later this year as well, or maybe early next year. So that was a federal government-funded sort of approach where there needs to be disclosure on the basically energy efficiency and electricity usage in any sort of asset when it goes out to rental or sort of sale of property. So any sort of addition of solar for any sort of asset type is a big win, because this does make it very much more attractive, we assume, as we've seen from the data as well, for those renters or buyers looking at purchasing those or renting those types of assets in the future. Common thing we also see is, if your apartment building saving $500 per year with shared solar, and say you're a tenant, what we quite often see is, and it doesn't always happen, but it's an opportunity for them, is the landlord and the tenant will negotiate to say increase by maybe a $5 or $10 a week increase in the next rent renewal period. So, tenants are obviously kept happy because all of a sudden their landlord's facilitated something that's saving them money. The landlord is saving money through their common area bills on top of the value added increase. Might have some tax benefits as well, depending on their situation. But it does mean that then there's a split benefit there as well. Now, from what we've also gathered from the data we've seen, UNSW did a study, which being New South Wales is nice and perfect, but where solar and among other things, broader electrification within an apartment building increase the value by around 12%. Now that equates to around 72,000. From a bit of the research and data we've taken, we generally look at it at a 3 to 5 times the investment cost when it comes to shared solar. So an average install cost per apartment full scope sits around that $3,500–4,000 mark from what we've seen for a typical average install. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. So you can use that 3 to 5 times rule as a good sort of indicator on that value, property value increase. Key thing to note as well, if you are selling or renting out your property, it is a really key thing to actually market upon because we've seen some really good feedback from people in those scenarios. And from the data we've seen in the conversations we've had with tenants, and a lot of the installers have had with tenants, people with a shared solar system stay longer. It's probably more about the rapport building between the tenant and the landlord. But from the data we've seen, it's quite impactful. As we mentioned earlier, I'd been to that site today, which was all 12 apartments were owned by one investor. So that's just one of many of those types of scenarios. So even those with a large landlord base or a high rented proportion, we highly recommend them taking part. Now, this is probably the most interesting part of this session as well. So for those that aren't aware, there was last federal election, there was a community solar banks pool of funding that came through. What that means is basically there's the opportunity, hopefully within the next 6 months, for some sort of rebates to be made available for shared solar on apartments. Now, there will be some criteria for this, these types of assets. There will be some, say, property value requirements, among other things. But if we looked at the Victorian program, this was a $2,800 rebate per apartment. This may be similar to New South Wales, we're not too sure. There was a cap of 5,000 apartments as part of this, and this is direct funding to that strata or owners corporation with that. So feel free to check out that website, the Solar for Apartments website, and that was specifically for shared solar with that. So looking forward to what comes for New South Wales later this year, but a key part of the Victorian one was the property value as well. So it was, sort of focusing those, lower value apartments to facilitate being able to access the benefits of shared solar. But more than happy to assist with particular guidance as that comes through. Now, other key thing to note as well, just for a bit of reference, we provide our own feasibility assessments, which we're more than happy to provide, that go into these types of things. They are very basic. So a lot of councils do provide, and I believe North Sydney still does as well, some really good in-depth assessments. So we always implore anyone being able to take advantage of those to do that. But as part of that, we sort of give a high-level piece on the SolShare suitability for a building. So with that, as you can see here, there's some example data. The designated roof space of solar, what the estimated suitable roof space is, and then being able to then allocate a solar system size accordingly for that. Estimated savings, budget, cost per unit, a bit of a payback. So we provide that. So you're more than welcome to reach out directly to get one of those for your building in New South Wales in preparation. At the end of the day, if you meet all the criteria for the solar banks funding that I mentioned earlier, later in the year, that's a plus. But it definitely is dependent on that property value piece. A lot of other common questions that we do get is around the roof types and roof access. So, irrespective of your roof type, maybe multifacet, peaked roof, flat roof, it really doesn't matter. It might be iron, tile, slate, concrete, among others. So all of these are more than able to be installed upon. There's just individual approaches that are taken for that, but the installers are at the end of the day best set. I will also mention that, you know, Allume as a company, we are simply the manufacturer of SolShare itself. So we don't do any of the installations, but because we are, of course, the developer of the technology SolShare, I guess we are the vocal point in, you know, sharing any information or education around how SolShare does work. So with these feasibility assessments that we do, they are completely desktop, and then, you know, we sort of introduce, more than happy to introduce to local installers within the network locally. And then, you know, more than happy for you guys to bring some, as long as they're accredited to install SolShare. That's absolutely fine. But a lot of the key issues that we see is convincing owners that aren't interested. So quite often webinars such as these types, the Q&As are really important for that, where we can answer questions. We support with a lot of Q&As directly with stratas as well, directly with strata managers, and bring them all together to make sure we find a solution that's suitable for everyone. The typical financials are really important as well. So, you know, that's how we pay for things. So one of those big questions, and we can always answer these questions in more detail. You know, a lot of the time you've got your maintenance fund, or sinking fund, sorry, and then your maintenance fund where suitable. After any rebates that are applied, of course, you've still got your special levy approach, and then if needed, there's the strata finance piece. And a lot of the time it's about gluing a bit of all of those together, as you need, depending on what sort of access you have to those. Now, this is a little bit of a scan. Feel free to scan that through and we can pop through an assessment. But the key part of tonight was wanting to answer some questions, and I guess letting as well Gary share a little bit about his experience as well in this space. So you've got my details here. We'll share a copy of the slides, or Jordan will be able to, after the meeting as well, or after the webinar. And then anyone is more than welcome to access that as well. So with that, Jordan, I'll pass to you to introduce Gary.
Thank you for that explanation. And yeah, we did have, before I introduce Gary, so Gary is a resident in North Sydney, and has installed, his building has installed an Allume SolShare system, which I think has been fairly recent. And then, so we might hear from Gary first, and then we'll get to all the questions at the end. But please feel free to send the questions. There's some really good ones there, and then we'll get to that. So thanks, Gary, for joining us tonight. Much appreciated.
Pleasure, Jordan. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
Good. Sorry, never actually done one of these before, so I have no idea if my technology goes wrong. Correct me.
We can see you. You're doing a great job.
Fantastic. And you've got the pictures that I sent you?
I actually, I don't actually, but it's okay. We can just, I think, just talk through it, and that's fine. So.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, we've been running a SolShare for 6 months now, I suppose. It went in December last year, and all of the unit holders are receiving solar on a daily basis. The issues that we faced, and I think everybody will face, is first of all trying to get all the unit holders on the same page. It's very difficult because we unfortunately don't have sufficient common areas to use solar for common areas. I mean, our common areas are essentially only illuminated at night, and there's not very many of them. So it would have just been a waste of time. So we went for providing solar to every unit.
So Gary, you decided not to. So your common area usage is quite small. So you decided not
it's
to
quite
also
small.
connect to the
we
common
just left
area.
it out.
Yeah. Okay.
We just left it out.
Yep.
And the difficulty is, of course, getting any group of individuals to agree to what could be a shared outcome. We were lucky. We used the North Sydney Council and gosh, what was the name of the people we had?
We've got yeah, it's part of the
Wattpack.
Yeah, what block? It's part of the Future Proofing
What block?
Apartment Program.
That's right.
Yeah.
They were terrific. I mean, they gave a very detailed review of our building. They went through not only solar, but we talked about heat pumps. We assessed the common area and ticked that off. Now, one of the problems that we had here is that our building, in fact, has a curved roof, which we thought was wonderful because the sun shines on it all day. But curved panels are not good. They're not very many of them. Most people seem to be installing flat panels. We were able to get some Sunman panels eventually, which are terrific. They follow the contour of the roof. They're unobtrusive. In fact, neighbours on either side have complimented us on the appearance of the solar because it improves, if anything, the roof line. It looks great. So the downside, the Sunman panels aren't quite as powerful as some of the flat panels you can get nowadays, but they're sufficient. We have quite a large roof. We were able to put a 14 kilowatt system in, serving all 5 apartments, and that of course runs through the SolShare. The issues that we had, we took the view that even though you can force solar to a degree with a relatively low vote of owners, we took the view that we wanted every owner to sign up for this. So we worked quite hard at it. And the approach we took was that we will treat solar as infrastructure. In other words, we will deliver a solar accessibility to each and every apartment. How you tend to use it is over to you. Some unit holders are toying with the idea of putting in batteries or a battery. Some unit holders are changing their behaviour so that they can use solar during the day. Obviously, in some apartments, people are going to work during the day, and their principal energy demand is at night. So everyone's requirements for solar are somewhat different. So the Strata Committee treated it as infrastructure. Here you are, it's available to you, whether you choose to use it during the day and export, or whether you choose to install a battery to help yourself during the night. If you want single phase car charging, that's okay. But those are all things that are at your cost. Once, as the Strata, we deliver the solar to each individual unit. We treated all units as being the same size. There's not much difference. There are some 4-bedroom units, some 3-bedroom units, and a couple of 2-bedroom units, but there's very little difference. So everybody receives an equal share of solar. Because of the shape of the roof and the Sunman panels that were used, we had a limited number of installers. We went with a commercial installer who do principally, I guess, big buildings and corporations, who had worked with these flexible panels before, and that was Energous. And I have to say they did a great job in terms of putting the solar in. The tradesmen that they used were fantastic. And I had some photos to show you of what the utility room looks like downstairs. The only thing we didn't anticipate was that Allume require at least a 4G connection to be able to monitor the distance monitor the solar. And apartment buildings, at least like ours, we've got this installed in the utility room in the bottom of the building, and there is absolutely no Wi-Fi or phone coverage. So we had to put in a 4G system just to connect up the Allume. It was a couple of $100, but it was something that we didn't anticipate right at the outset. So where you put it is important. That said, it's all gone really well. unit holders had a few questions. In fact, they had a lot of questions at the beginning. And it's well worthwhile, if there is someone in the block who is technically inclined, to be across all this. Most of it came back to me, and
Was that you, Gary?
I'm a real
Are
Luddite.
you on? Were you technically inclined? Like,
No, I'm a
no.
Luddite. But you know, it's amazing what you learn. Unfortunately, Energous just put the system in and did a really good job, but then left. And I was chasing them for quite a few weeks to try and understand how the system worked, and I think they were in turn chasing Allume. In terms of the way the system works, it's okay. We don't get necessarily an equal share of power across all the 5 units. The Allume software has 3 outputs. We've got 5 units. One of them's got 3-phase power, which means that the amount of solar going to all units isn't quite uniform. Some units are getting a little bit more than others, but at the end of the day, I'm not bothered. It's close enough. And I guess that's probably about it, Jordan.
Yeah, great. Were you on the Strata committee leading this? Yeah.
Yes, they are.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm the secretary of the committee, and otherwise known as Muggins. Yeah, I was pushing it.
Yeah, in terms of the funding for it, is that something that you had been planning for and had it in the budget, or you had a separate fund for it and
No, we
saved over the years?
had sufficient money in the sinking fund to
Yep.
pay for it. Because of the complications of our building, it was more expensive than we anticipated. We're certainly not going to pay it back, selling power back to the grid. But that's a question for each individual owner. I mean, I know some unit owners who are, because they're at home during the day, they've been able to change their routines, and they're effectively using about 70% of all the solar available, which has a big impact on their bill. I know one of the unit holders, because they are a single person, because they are sometimes away, are only using about 30% of their solar. So they're actively looking for ways that they can better use their solar. They're looking at perhaps putting in a heat pump. They're toying with the ideas of batteries. So yeah, it's a mixed bag, but you know, it's an individual unit holder's decision, really, as to what they do, and everyone's approaching it a little bit differently.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for taking the time to explain that. Did your strata levies go up after you installed the system, or have you?
No,
okay.
not at all. Everybody has a reduced electricity bill. We were fortunate that we had enough in our capital works fund to be able to just pay for it. It worked out at between $9,000 and $10,000 a unit, but that was fine because the money had been put aside anyway. So, as I say, it's a little bit more expensive than we would have otherwise have wished, but that's because of the complexity of the building.
Yep. Will, maybe this is a question you can answer about the, are there any sort of ongoing monthly costs for the Allume system, or any subscription costs or anything like that?
Good question, Jordan. So with when it comes to, I guess, SolShare in a building, it's all sort of capex. So it's just that initial upfront cost. There's no ongoing subscription or cost associated with that. If anything, for as Gary mentioned about the 4G connection, I guess that's facilitated so everyone can see their own information and their own data as well on their own portals. The only thing is just a data plan associated with that 4G SIM card, which is usually every 12 months or every 3 years on what's approached. So it might be a every couple of years I'm not sure if there's a plan that you guys got, Gary, or whether it's just
Yes.
yeah,
An annual plan. It's a few $100s. It's not breaking the bank at all.
beautiful.
Great.
And apart, it's just, I guess, from a cost perspective, long term. I mean, the idea is they're 25, 30-year systems at the end of the day. The maintenance associated with that, generally, once you get the install finalized, the installers will recommend a maintenance plan. Usually it's a yearly check or every 2-year check, maybe a annual or biannual panel clean, depending on the location. If you're near the ocean, panel clean's probably worth doing more often. But at the end of the day, it's just those maintenance checks that are the key thing.
Yep.
Yeah, great.
There's no maintenance associated with SolShare, for example. It's really just the inverters that need to be maintained, and then just checking the electrical safety with any sort of electrical install is the key thing ongoing.
Yep. Some really good questions coming through. We're sort of running out of time. Well, let's see. We'll see if we can get through as many as we can. Let's see, and feel free to jump in, Will or Gary, if you can see any as well, and you want to just answer off the top of your head. So we've answered the one about infrastructure, common area.
Yeah, of course, common areas connected.
Yep.
Flat roof, don't need a flat roof. In saying that, well, as Gary's gone through, you can have the curved roof as well.
Yep.
Come across many curved roofs, of course, but whether it's a pitched roof, whether it's tiles, that's more than fine as well. I like a metal roof is the cheap, a flat metal roof, even if it's angled, it's probably the cheapest type of roof to install upon. Tiles are a little bit more, concrete more again. But at the end of the day, it's just what's required for that building, of course.
Is there any size limitations for SolShare? So someone saying that they're in a apartment block with 98 units, would that be possible?
It really depends on the roof space and whether everyone takes part as well. In 99% of the cases, even though in the initial conversations, not everyone may be willing to take part or think of taking part, we find that 99% of the time, everyone does end up taking part because you meet the requirements to get that ordinary resolution through the decision-making process. And especially where there's rebates available in future for those buildings that are applicable, that's excellent. I mean, even for those that aren't, it's still that really good value add for that. So it really just depends whether they want to do all those floors, all those 98 units. I mean, I've done sites with, I'm doing a site at the moment with 150 units. It's 10 stories. So it is just dependent on assessing that rooftop. More than happy to give that a feasibility assessment if required. I think it's TES there as well. And just to sort of mention whether it's possible or not from a very high level. And then from there, we are, as far as where Allume's situated, we just do the desktop side of things. Anything on site or on site assessments are done by qualified solar installers. And it's up to them to then sort of take on that process. We'll always be in the background to help where called upon. But then they can sort of offer the best solution for that customer.
Okay. So, yeah, because that was a question. So desktop analysis, and then solar installer, and then you sort of talk and sort of work out the best solution after that. Is that sort of right? Yep.
Absolutely, Jordan. I mean, we can always, we won't recommend one installer over another at the end of the day, but what we can recommend is, has the full scope been covered by these quotes? The last thing you guys want is, variations, of a contract throughout the process of a project. So we try to sort of help where we can to make sure that full scope for that site has been covered. In saying that, sometimes you'll discover some things with existing infrastructure on sites, but the idea is just minimizing that as much as possible.
Yep, sure. What about smart meters? Does everyone need one, and then do they have to be the same?
Yeah, great question. So if you want to be connected to solar, so because we are behind the meter solar in the same way that, standalone homes have behind the meter solar, you are required to upgrade to a smart meter. The reason for that is because you sell the energy at a reduced rate to what you buy it at, the energy retailers need to be able to tell the difference between importing energy to your apartment or exporting back to them. So That's why they require that from a regulatory perspective to have a smart meter installed. A little bit annoying, but it is just what it is, of course. The models don't have to be the same at all. So as long as it's a smart meter, it's solar ready, which any smart meter really is, or most of them are, or anything installed in today's day and age, then that's completely fine.
Yeah, okay, great. Someone asked about the was it the Mike about two-way pricing. Can you shut the system off during the daytime? Do you have that ability? Would you want to do that? Is anyone doing that at all with an Allume system?
Yeah, and good question, Jordan. Mike. So with that, we've seen Osgrid had implemented two-way pricing recently. I think I heard the other day that they have since revoked that. I'm not sure if that's correct or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
As a sort of trial, but in these scenarios, there's I guess a few things you can do. So whether you add batteries in future, and you can either add a battery associated with the inverter. Depending on the brand of inverter, or you could have a battery per apartment, depending on what you wanted to do in that standpoint. With those aspects, you could save a lot of that solar to then be utilized at other times during the day, or you can export limit the site as well. So the inverter then will not export anything back to the network, which is a method of doing that. But if that does get to the point where you do get penalized for solar going back to the network, I think there'll be a much larger overhaul of all solar within the network, because there are a lot of standalone homes, because standalone homes on average export 70%, just from the previous experience I've had previous to SolShare or working with Allume. So yeah, there's no, like, from a risk perspective, it's pretty low for the short term. And there'll be plenty of time to react if that does happen in future.
Yeah, great. Okay. So yes, I think Wendy asked about smaller apartment block sizes. I mean, Gary's just already talked about that he has 5 units, so it does work for any size. It's really about the rooftop. Is that right, Will?
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
I'd say five's the bare minimum that we like to work with. You
Okay.
can get away with maybe 4 or 3 really, but generally five's the bare minimum. Usually we say 6, but because I believe with Gary there was the 3-phase tenancy, as you mentioned, that is the equivalent. You could call it 3 apartments if you wanted to do that, because it's 3 connections or 3 phases. If you connect all 3 of those. So it's just dependent on what's suitable, of course. But yeah, 5's probably the starting point as a general rule, from where to start from.
Okay, so I think we're through most of the questions. Just about one question about unexpected costs. Is that Gary mentioned, buying a $200 4G sort of device to connect the system. Is there any other general sort of considerations people might have to think about that might be an additional cost from solar, or that you generally come across?
I'd say the meter boards are a key consideration. So depending on the age of your meter board and whether you do already have smart meters, usually for New South Wales, not many sites do have smart meters. So there's just the condition of that meter board that's a key thing. So a lot of the time we're seeing meter boards or even meters being changed over to smart meters prior to solar install in preparation, sort of getting that process kicked off, which is more than possible.
Yep.
Usually it helps to work with the solar installer to facilitate that. On top of that, yeah, that meter board upgrade piece can be a key thing. So if you want to sort of do any sort of electrification work within a building, the meter board, where modified, if you haven't touched it for 30 years, it's probably not up to spec. But if you do touch it and involve any other new technology to that local electrical infrastructure, you are then obliged to upgrade that meter board to current standard. So a lot of the time, solar is the first thing that sort of kicks that off. In saying that, from a safety perspective and insurance perspective, they do prefer, or most insurance firms do prefer, up-to-date electrical infrastructure, because you do significantly reduce your, say, risk of fire, or even from a safety perspective, to be honest, things deteriorate, standards change, things have become more safe. So it is a key consideration for those sites that do need a meter board replacement. and it is something that your maintenance fund or your capital fund is there to support. And it's just remembering, I guess, those costs can be balanced out across everyone, and in where there are rebates available to help out, that does obviously help where applicable. But if you got EVs in the future, or hot water heat pumps or batteries, though, that's going to have to happen anyway. It's one of those things to got to get on top of as soon as you can. We look at Victoria. If you're renting out a standalone home, your meter board has to be up to standard. You cannot rent it out if it is not. And in the sort of the apartment space, it's a little bit more of a grey area, but it's moving through to that. So New South Wales are looking at following suit with that. So it's always a good thing to kick it off. Whilst not everyone, say, is upgrading their meter boards on a regulatory requirement, sort of better while it's more affordable, I'd recommend to do it ASAP and be ready for these sorts of things. But that's my personal opinion, just on the cost sensitivity point of view.
Yep, absolutely. It doesn't get all the spotlight that solar and batteries and EV chargers do, but it is really important piece of the puzzle. So, and an absolute consideration. Yeah. What was the state of yours meter board like, Gary? Did you have to do any upgrades on that?
No, we were reasonably okay, and 4 of the unit holders switched over smart meters, and that was all free of charge by the retailers.
Yep.
We've got one unit holder who hasn't yet switched over. He's still on his old meter because he's discovered that as long as he's on the old meter, it goes backwards with solar. So I don't know how long he'll be able to get away with that.
Pretend no one heard that.
Yeah, I wouldn't
I'll pretend I didn't hear that as well.
I've got one question for Will, if I may. Will, what's the current status of using an EV as your household battery and putting an inverter in so that you can run the house off, or the apartment off the EV overnight?
Yeah, good question, Gary. And it's quite an interesting one. A lot of the advice around, say, EVs, as we currently stand, integrating into apartments, is mainly just on the charging side of things. And a lot of the time, that's all done through the common area and charged in a separate way. But of course, when it comes to SolShare and in your building, for example, Gary, if you have an EV charger connected behind your own meter as a load on that meter, it means you can then charge that EV. Now, for the vehicle to home, if we want to put it that way, currently from a regulatory perspective, we can't do that yet. There's been some trials done, but from my understanding, we're still yet to see that as a long-term opportunity. Reason being is just they've got to do all the safety risk considerations and regulatory work to go into that. But on top of that, then there's that potential for vehicle to grid as well. So even using your vehicle to, almost like you would a Tesla on a VPP, for example, virtual power plant, and making money and arbitraging energy where you can to the network. So really good opportunities, but that's where the benefits of SolShare come in, because you can use your solar to charge your EV, and then use your EV to charge your home in the evenings when that comes through, which hopefully is soon. But
it's a regulatory thing, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, I think we might wrap it up. But Gary, really appreciate you taking the time to come out tonight and talk about your system. Glad it's working well for you. So
all happy.
Yeah, and Will, thank you for talking about the Allume system. We'll be sure to pass on your details that you listed and links to Allume there. So thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Jordan. Really
No
appreciate it.
Thank you, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks to everyone as well for coming out tonight. There was a question about support from council. So in the strata space, we are 2 main areas really. So firstly, the Future Proof Apartment Program, where we provide free building assessments, including solar PV recommendations for each building. But include the full gamut of considerations for sustainable upgrades for your building. And then we also have our sustainability rebate program, and that includes solar PV, batteries, EV chargers for strata. So we've heavily weighted the funding towards strata in the acknowledgement that it is harder to do and more costly. And so we want to support, especially because most of our residents live in apartment buildings in North Sydney. So that's what we're there to support. So I'll send out links to both of those programs as well. But thanks for joining us, everyone, and have a good night.
Thanks, Jordan.